Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Yud Bet. I mentioned once in class, not enough, I guess, but I mentioned that the Sukkot dapim were going up early. They're already up. The dapim for the first 3 days of Sukkot. For those who have a 3-day yantif, you can get ahead. They're shorter dapim also, which makes it a little easier. You have to go through the links, which you can find on our site. There's actually a post, an author post on our site, so you can find it in the Beyond the Daf section, which has a link to all the dapim for Sukkot. So if you even probably Google search Sukkot on our site, you'll find the links to the 3 pages. And then on Wednesday, they'll go up as normal, like they go up on a Friday, that kind of thing. After the Shiur goes up, they'll all go up in order. And the podcast, they'll only be up on Wednesday. And there's no Zoom on Friday. Okay, next week there will be Zoom on Friday, just to not get confused. I know next week there's also a 3-day Chag, but next week I'll teach on Friday because here it's not Chag, and I kind of did a combo of sometimes yes, sometimes no. Okay, with that, we will get started. Reminding you about Alana Stein-Hain's Shiur Dini Daf about the kind of more modern take on the women inheriting and what is more commonly practiced and how is the law circumvented, basically. Also, Shuli Mishkin's flashback went up yesterday about this thing we ended with about Yair and who was Yair and Menashe and all sorts of interesting psukim that seem to say all sorts of interesting things about the tribe of Menashe. And Shuli does a good job of kind of making order of a whole bunch of things that you might or might not have noticed that don't seem to jive, and how we can make them work out and what's going on here. So if you want to learn more about Menashe, it's called the Lost Tribe, and you can if that doesn't pique your interest enough, this idea of some lost tribe, and maybe they were lost way back when, not even when we think about the lost tribes. So happy reading. Okay, let's go on now with our daf. I want to start again because it's really important to set up before we get into today's stuff. There's a study guide, so I recommend you use it. I can't remember if I read the dedication, so I'm going to read it now. Today's stuff is sponsored by Joanna Ram in loving memory of her mother, Rose Ram Surah Rezel, on her 16th year at site. She's still with me every day, my inner teacher. Didn't read it, so good, I read it now. So now we're going to get started with where we ended. We started with this question, Ha'ishet Ishto, right? We're in a slew of questions. Where do we get this from? Where do we derive that? Right? Where does Torah say this? So where does the Torah, or really the Tanakh, we're going to see, teach us that Ha'ish et Ishto, that a man inherits from his wife? We had 2 basic explanations. Rabbi Akiva, who said, right, first it wasn't said in the name of Rabbi Akiva, then we saw it was Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Sheiro is Ishto. We have Rav and Abaye, who each cut the pasuk or fix things a little bit in a different way to make it make sense. Otherwise, it really sounds like the woman inherits from the husband and not the reverse. So they explain it each in their own way, how Rabbi Akiva does it. Then we brought Rabbi Yishmael, who brought these 5 psukim. And I want to read the psukim inside because this will be a good basis for everything we're going to do today. I'm going to share my screen and show you the psukim inside. So we have the psukim from Bamidbar Lamed Vav. 3 of them come from here. So Bamidbar Lamed Vav, again, in chapter 36, it describes that God says the Benot Tzlafchad, right after the people in Menashe start complaining. If they marry, they're going to marry people from a different tribe, and then we're going to be stuck. So he says, this is what I'm telling Benot Tzlafchad. You can get married to whoever you want, but it has to be within your tribe. Why? Verse 7 says, "V'lo tisov nachala lebnei Yisrael mimatel mateh." We don't want land to move from tribe to tribe. Okay, and then ki ish b'nachalat mateh avotav yidbeku b'nei Yisrael. Tomorrow we're going to focus more on these words because a person in the nachala of his father should the person should have his nachala stick within the Jewish people. We want to keep the tribe's land where it is. And then it says, "V'chol bat yoreshet nachala mimatot b'nei Yisrael," and then any girl, this is not just Benot Tzlafchad, but any girl who inherits land, which means any girl. Now, this is important to understand. Who has to marry within their tribe? Just girls or daughters that, or women that are like Benot Tzlafchad, that they are in line to become heirs to their father's property, basically because they have no brothers. So this is only for for women who have no brothers. And if you remember, and this is be important for later in today's stuff, we explained this pasuk, Kol bat yoreshet nachala mimatot b'nei Yisrael. We had a different drasha on this pasuk, okay, before we get to the continuation of the pasuk. But we said mimatot, from tribes, it should be from one tribe. right? She inherits from her father. We said, oh, this must be teaching us that daughters inherit also from their mothers. And from there we learn that the mother passes on inheritance to her son and daughter, because one's daughter, kavachomer sons, that was all yesterday's stuff. So this pasuk, okay, and this just is going to be important for later, not right now, is actually referring to a girl who inherits actually from her mother and her father. It would be true for even someone who just inherits from her father, but it's also specifically referring to someone who inherits from the father and the mother. Now, what does it say about her? If she inherits from her father or her mother or both, then she can all, it really means her father or also or her mother. She has to marry someone mimate aviha tialisha. Okay, so she must marry someone from her father's tribe. Okay, you might realize this already, and maybe I should just mention it so that when we get to Abaye's question later, you'll understand. It doesn't exactly resolve the problem. If she inherits from two tribes, a mother and a father, and her mother could be theoretically maybe from a different tribe, right? Her mother is from a different tribe. That was the whole point. Mimatot, then how does it resolve the issue to have her marry within her father's tribe? Okay, let's just give an example that we'll use later. If a woman is from, her mother's from Shimon, her father's from Reuven, and she inherits from both of them, right? She's going to get land from her mother and land from her father. That's what we said the pasuk is referring to, and that's how he teaches us a mother gives inheritance to her child. She's going to get land from Shimon and she's going to get land from Reuven. What does it help her to marry someone from Reuven? It only helps for her father's, it doesn't help from her mother's. Her mother's is going to move tribes. That we're going to deal with in the second part of today's stuff. Okay, so that's just important to understand because we're here and we're reading the psukim, but it's not relevant for right now. So going back to our psukim, we had the first pasuk said we don't want, right? Pasuk Zayin, we don't want the nachala to leave mimatel mateh. Then it says any daughter who inherits. Okay, now let's just skip the whole matot thing. So she has to marry a chad mishpacha mateh via elisha. She has to marry within her tribe. Why? L'mayin yeshu b'nei Israel ish nachalat avotam, so that we keep the land in its proper place. That's a total repeat of the previous pasuk. Now, it's not exactly a repeat because the first pasuk was really referring to B'not Tzlachcha. Now we're getting to the general laws, but still, it's saying the same idea. And pasuk Tet continues this and says, "V'lo tisov nachala mimateh l'mateh acher," because and we don't do something that will cause the land to move from one tribe to another. Ki ish b'nachalato yidbeku matot b'nei Israel. Here again, you have the ish. Again, you have the yidbeku, the same words as appeared before, right? Because we want the land to stick to its tribe that it was in. Okay, so what did we do yesterday? We saw Rabbi Yishmael who brought 5 psukim. First, they brought verse 8, then they brought verse 7, then they brought verse 9, all 3 of them saying the same idea, that we don't want land to move from one place to the other, and that's why she has to marry within the tribe to keep the land within the tribe. All saying the same thing. And then we brought these 2 other psukim about Elazar, the son of Aaron, dying. They buried him in the place where Pinchas, right, this area of Pinchas, his son, which they say, well, if it was Pinchas's, it must have been his father's. How else could he have land that wasn't his father's? And if Elazar was buried in Elazar's own land, it would have said it. Why would it say specifically in Givat Pinchas? So from there we learn that Pinchas must have married someone and inherited her property. And then we have the same idea with Skuv, who gave birth to Yair, who had 23 cities in the land of Gilad. And again, if Skuv gave birth to Yair, why was it to Yair that Yair had 23 cities? It should have been Skuv's 23 cities, to which we said he must have married, right? Married rich, he married a woman and inherited, right? And inherited her property. Okay, so there we have those 5 psukim. Now the Gemara is going to obviously ask, what do we need 5 psukim for? Okay, you can continue to follow along in the study guide if you want, but I'm not going to share it. It's not as necessary for the continuation. So we're now on line 2 of our daf. Mai va'omer. Why do we need all these psukim? V'chi tema b'sibat habenka kapikra aval ba lo yarit tashma v'lo tisov nachala l'bnei Yisrael mimatel mateh. We're basically going to go one by one and say, if we only had the first pasuk, what could you have said? Remember, how can land be transferred by this woman who marries outside of her tribe to a different tribe? In 2 ways, really. It could either go to her husband, which is what we said, but theoretically, we learned already that a mother passes on inheritance to her son. So if she's from Shimon, marries someone from Reuven, and then her inheritance is going to pass on to Reuven through her son, it would be a problem already. not just her husband. So those psukim don't necessarily teach that it's going to pass to the husband, which is what we were trying to learn. It could be you can't marry someone from a different tribe because it will pass to your son, who will be from a different tribe because the tribe goes by the father. That's why you need the second pasuk. Okay, so you have two psukim, and then the assumption is what? You have two psukim saying the same thing, which we already see three like that, right? One must be referring to one situation, and one is referring to a different situation. Well, okay, well then you don't need to continue on. We've already got it. Well, v'chitema, you might say, lavor alav belav va'ase. Now, remember, one pasuk said that Kol bat yoreshet nachala has to marry within the tribe so that the land will stay within the tribe. That's what we call an aseh. That's a mitzvah aseh. You are commanded to marry within your tribe. The other pasuk says, "V'lo tisov nachala." We don't want, right? Don't allow the nachala to pass. That's a lo taseh. That's a negative command. So perhaps the reason why it said one and the other is it's all about we're worried you're going to pass it on to your son and not your husband, in which case we're stuck and we don't have a proof for what we're looking for. But because one is telling you there's a positive commandment and one is telling you there's a negative commandment, we've seen many times that some mitzvot come with an aseh and a lo taseh, right? Like return a lost item, don't ignore it, right? You have both an aseh and a lo taseh. It makes it a stronger halacha by having both. So that's why Tashma, that's why we have a third pasuk. Lo tisav nachala mimateh l'mateh acher. That's why we brought the third pasuk. Because theoretically, you could have thought the first two are hasabat ben. You're worried it's going to go through the son. And it's an aseh and a lo taseh. But the third pasuk would already prove that, okay, we really don't need this one. This one must be teaching. We're also worried it'll go through the husband. But obviously, that's not going to be enough because we have 5 psukim and not 3. Well, v'chitem alav or alav b'shnei lavim v'aseh. Could be this is such a strong issue that it's teaching you there's 2 negative commandments here and 1 positive commandment. And that is very common that we have it. And what does it mean? It means you might get 2 sets of lashes if you go against this law. So it makes it much more severe. That's why Tashma Elazar ben Aharon meit v'chulei. That's why we need the pasuk about Pinchas. Okay, we still have one more after this. V'chitema, you might say, Elazar hu denasid itita umeita v'yarta Pinchas. Wait a minute. We just said it could go through the son. So maybe Elazar is the one who married someone from a different tribe and she died and Pinchas inherited her land. Okay, now you might say, how could he do this, right? If you're not allowed to marry outside the tribe, so how did he marry someone outside the tribe? So there's a very easy answer, and this is going to come up later as well, not in the Gemara, but it's going to be the premise of Abaye's question, which is you could have a situation, if it's forbidden for a woman from a different tribe, okay, remember, if I'm from, okay, I happen to be from Shevet Levi, my family's Kohanim. I'm a bad example because Levi doesn't have their own land, but let's say I'm from Shimon and I want to marry someone from Reuven. I'm allowed to, unless I'm an only daughter, which I happen not to be. So I have brothers, so I don't have to worry about it. I can marry anybody I want. But so the prohibition is only for someone who's supposed to inherit, meaning she has no brothers. However, you could have a situation where a woman inherits, even though she wasn't supposed to inherit. What could happen? You could have a woman who has a brother, and then her brother dies before the father. And then if the brother has no children, we're going to get to this, the brother has no children, then she could end up marrying, she could end up inherit, right? She could marry anyone she wants because she has a brother. Then the brother dies and then the father dies, then she's going to be an heir. So that's the example we're really going to be talking about later. As Gita points out, we're going to see that it was only temporary, this whole thing. But if you're talking the time of Elazar and Pinchas, that was the time. So, it's hard to say. But anyway, that's true that that's a possible answer, that in the end it was repealed. But again, Gita, to answer your question, we're specifically talking about this Isur, that you can't. So we're talking about when the psukim are referring to this, we still can have situations where this happens. So anyway, we'll get back to that. So maybe it was through the mother giving to her son and not a mother giving to her, and not a woman giving to her husband, in which case that wouldn't prove it. That's why you need another pasuk, Tashma, and then it's going to be the same theory as before. Why need psukim to say the same thing? One must be talking about giving through, the Elazar, let's say, married a woman and it passed to Pinchas through her, meaning mother to son. And then you have Skubalita Yair, which would teach you woman giving to her husband. And that Yair must have married a woman from a different tribe who became an heir. Now, that explains our 5 psukim, to which the Gemara asks, though, wait a minute. V'chi tema hatam nami hachihu. Im kain trei krai lamali. What if, okay, first question. What if you say also maybe Skuv married and the land came to Yair through the mother? And that's what I explained before, because what do you need 2 psukim for? Okay, so that's a side question that gets immediately resolved, right? There's no point to bring 2 psukim. Now, why did the Gemara even ask this one before it was clear? If there's 1 psukim, 2 psukim saying the same thing, and one must be referring to one and one must be referring to the other. Because before they were all next to each other. Here we have some story told about Pinchas and how he buried his father, and then where he buried his father. Then we have another pasuk talking about Skuv and Yair, and they're in 2 totally different places, talking about 2 totally different situations. You wouldn't necessarily say one doesn't need to be there if the other one's there. They're talking about 2 totally different things. But still, they didn't need to describe specifically that the son had something the father didn't. And the reason was it must have repeated this issue because it wanted to tell us one is talking about it went through the son, and one is talking about it went through the husband. And there you have your proof. However, Rav Papa is not so satisfied with this. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye. Mimai. Maybe really the husband never inherits. And cry b'sibara ben kedishanin. And the first 3 psukim really are talking about the son inheriting and not the husband. Now, we all know the husband inherits, but they're just saying, maybe you can't prove it from these psukim. Rav Papa really seems to be against Rabbi Yishmael's position. Not that he says it, but where he gets it from. Because we can always go back to Rabbi Akiva, who says, the she'erov yarashota, and learn it from there. So he's against this drasha of Rabbi Yishmael. And he says, you could be saying 3 psukim in Sefer Bamidbar are all coming to say, 1 asay, 2 lo tases, and we're all concerned that the land's going to go through the son. And that's why she can't marry out. But then what do you do with the psukim about Yair and Pinchas? Very simple. Yair dezavim mizban, Pinchas nami dezavim mizban. What do you mean? How did the son have something the father didn't have? They purchased it. Very simple. The only way to get land is not only to inherit, you can purchase. What's the issue with purchasing? Well, you purchase it, it goes back in the Jubilee year, remember? Assuming it's an ancestral field. So, Amarle, because of that, Pinchas, right? Abaye answers him, Pinchas dezabin mizban lo matzid amrit. There's no way you could say Pinchas bought this land. Maybe Yair could have bought all those cities, but Pinchas couldn't have. Why? Because what's this pasuk describing? Where was Elazar buried? He was buried in the territory. Let's say you go with what Rav Papa suggested. He was buried in the territory that Pinchas purchased. Well, in kendim tzedek chozer b'yovel, v'nimtzat tzadik kavor b'kever she'eno shelo. There's no way that they would have buried Elazar in a place who was, number one, a tzaddik. Forget about anyone else, but particularly was a tzaddik. What, you're going to say that he purchased land that he purchased land, buried his father there, and it's going to go back to somebody else in the Jubilee year? That doesn't make any sense. So, Ela Ema de naflale mistei haramim. It must be. Now, how? Now, this is a good explanation. I see you wrote in the chat, he was a Levi. Levites didn't have land, but they do get land. The Kohanim get land. How do the Kohanim get land? Anytime someone says, my field is cherem, okay, it's not cherem like excommunication. It's called cherem. It's a way of saying something sanctified to the temple or sanctified in some way. And the land goes to the Kohanim. So it could be that that's what's going on here. And that's what Rav Papa says. And with that, Rav Papa basically rejects this explanation of the Braita, basically, and Rabbi Yishmael's position. He says, I don't really get why you could easily, or not easily, but you could explain these psukim, that the first 3 psukim are talking about we're worried it's going to go through the son, and that's why she can't marry out. And we have 1 mitzvah, 1 positive commandment, 2 negatives. The pasuk about Yair could be he purchased it, and the pasuk about Pinchas could be that he got it in cherem, and from a cherem that somebody sanctified. And from that, we have no proof that it goes to the husband, and he rejects this. Now, the Rashbam and others think that the sugya ends here, and that's it. And basically, we end up with Abaye thinking this is okay, and you can read it that way, and Rav Papa raising a question saying these 5 psukim don't really prove what Rabbi Yishmael is trying to prove from them. Some people think that the Abaye in the next phrase, and then Amar Abaye in the next line, according to this interpretation, is something new. Some people have a bit of a different girsa and think that Abaye is actually responding to Rav Papa, but we're not going to go with that. I just want you to know that there's two totally different ways to read this Gemara. But we're going to read it like the Rashban, and we're now starting a new section. So that first section was all about the drasha of Rabbi Yishmael. Again, we had two drasha, one Rabbi Akiva, one Rabbi Yishmael. The Rabbi Akiva drasha yesterday already, we had to explain in two possible ways, Rav and Abaye. The Rabbi Yishmael drasha, we have Abaye who basically, stands up to Rav Papa and explains why he thinks this definitely proves. He doesn't actually go against Rav Papa, but he seems to have no problem with Rav Papa saying. Rav Papa says these five really don't prove it, right? He thinks, and the Stam of the Gemara explains it in a way that we understood why the combination of the five psukim, and each one theoretically could have proven it, but since each one could have sort of been disproven and explained some other way, the combination of the five make it clear that there must be at least one of them that's referring to a husband inheriting from his wife, and that ends our section. So again, we're left with an open question, really, because Rav Papa seems to be rejecting it. Moving on now, Amar Abaye, and now Abaye comes up with the question I told you before. Kol bat yoreshet nachala mimatot, which we said the subject of that sentence is a woman who is inheriting from two parents from different tribes. We'll keep with this example. The father is from Reuven, the mother is from Shimon. She's an only daughter, or at least has no brothers, and she's supposed to inherit. She is now about to get married. She has to find a husband from Shevet Reuven, which, as we're going to see now, I already told you this question. Abaye says it doesn't really resolve the issue. If she's supposed to inherit land from Shimon through her mother, she's going to end up taking land from Shimon and moving it to Reuven. So Amar Abaye, self, in the end, either way, the land from her mother's tribe is going to move to her father's tribe. Okay, so assuming, and this is why, Gita, you have to, going back to your question, you have to assume we're talking about a time when this was usher, because we're explaining the pasuk, which forbids it. So even though it's true, it will be repealed further on. We're talking about what the pasuk says. If she has a mother from Shevet Shimon and a father from Shevet Reuven, how could that possibly be? So the commentaries explain, like I did before, which is her mother must have had a brother and therefore been allowed to marry someone from Shevet Reuven. Okay, or you could say she did it Isur, but we're assuming we have a way that she did it permissibly. So she married thinking it's fine because I'm not going to inherit my father's property anyway. But then she ended up, the brother died, then the father died, she inherits the property, and now we have an issue. So she didn't do anything wrong, but the daughter now can only marry Reuven, which doesn't really make sense because she's still going to get land from her mother from Shimon, and it's going to go either to her husband or to her son, who's in Shevet Reuven. So how's that going to resolve the problem? So now the Gemara questions Abaye and says, Mimai. Dilma, tries to answer really his question and says, Mimai. Dilma shane hatam shekfar husaba. Well, when the mother married the father and then became an heiress, maybe it already is considered at that point like the land from Shimon was already supposed to go to Reuven, even though it hadn't yet. But the daughter's doing nothing wrong that hasn't already happened. Okay, it partially happened, right? It didn't happen yet because the land isn't yet still owned by the woman, by the mother. But since the mother's already married to someone from Reuven, the daughter is not doing anything worse. She'll also marry someone from Reuven, and the land already was designated. So it's as if the land already moved. This word husaba comes from the word v'lo tisov nachala, meaning it won't be transferred. So we're going to view this as if your mother's from Shimon and your father's from Reuven, your mother's, and you're supposed to inherit your mother and your father. Well, your mother's land is already kind of considered Reuven's because she's already married to him and it's in line to be passed on to someone from Reuven. So that's why you're not doing anything worse by staying within the tribe of Reuven. You're resolving your father's land. It won't move to a different tribe. And your mother's land anyway was moving out. I'm changing the words now based on the Bach. You see there's a little aleph there. Instead of Amrle, it should say Vidilma. So Abaye says that doesn't resolve my question because Vidilma shekvar husaba lo amrinan. Well, the mother's land hasn't yet left Shimon's property yet. In other words, it's still hers. She's from Shimon, okay, even though she's married to someone from Reuven, but it hasn't actually left Shimon's tribe yet because it hasn't actually passed to her husband. It hasn't passed to her son yet. So perhaps we don't say it's as if something happened yet. And therefore, we do forbid the daughter because by the daughter marrying someone from Shevet Reuven, Okay, now, again, this is where we're stuck. This is where Abaye doesn't understand this pasuk. He says, if you say that the mother, nothing yet moved, so the daughter has to do whatever she can to keep it within the same tribe, then we're back to square one. And that's Abaye is suggesting that maybe we don't say it was already done because it hasn't moved yet from Shimon. And then we're back to square one with our question. How can she marry someone from Reuven when knowing that she's going to inherit from her mother and she's going to actually move out land then once she dies to her son or to her husband, no matter what it's going to leave, and maybe it should be forbidden for her. So remember, the mother didn't do anything intentionally, but she's doing it knowing, right? The mother didn't think she was going to inherit at all. So it was okay for her and nothing yet moved. So the daughter is doing something worse by actually knowing what's going to happen and making sure it continues. In other words, she's going to now ensure that the land of Shimon is going to move to Reuven. So it all depends on this perspective. Do you assume that it's as if, do we view it as if the land already moved because the mother's married to someone from Reuven, and it's as if the land from Shimon is going to move to Reuven anyway, so the daughter's doing nothing wrong? That's what they try to answer to Abaye, and Abaye says, who knows if that's the case? Maybe we don't view it that way. And then Abaye brings it back to the question. So Rav Yeimar, and there's again a bit of a different way of understanding what exactly he's doing here, but he basically proves that it must be kfar husaba. It's a bit of circular reasoning, but he said otherwise you're right. The pasuk makes no sense. Because, okay, I'm going to read it inside now, but what Rav Yeimar is going to basically say is, I'm going with the answer the Gemara gave to Abaye, because otherwise you're right. The pasuk makes no sense. So the only way to read the pasuk is to assume that once the mother's married to the father, and she's from Shimon, he's from Reuven, we must view it as if the land was already transferred, and that's why we're only concerned with her nachala of her father and make sure she marries within Reuven and not really worried about the mother. So that's what he's going to say right now, and then Abaye is going to have a retort to this. Amar Rav Yeimar the Rav Ashi. Okay, he didn't speak to Abaye, but he spoke to Rav Ashi, and he said to Rav Ashi the following. And then again, I already told you the gist of what he said, but now we're going to read it inside. And it's a structure of an Iyamart Bishlama. Iyamart Bishlama means if you say this, it will make sense, but if you say that, it won't make sense, and therefore process of elimination, option 2 must not be right. Iyamart Bishlama shekvar husaba harutimachukavakha ben besibat haben ben besibat habal. There's a few keywords missing here. I'll add them in, but we'll read it and explain. It must be that you should right. It reads well if you say that we view it once the mother is from Shimon and the father's from Reuven, and then the mother becomes in line to inherit her property from her father, and let's say even does, we must view it as if it's already in line to go to the husband or the son, and therefore the daughter's doing nothing wrong, and that's why Hainu de Matum Gakra, and this is why we say the pasuk must be referring to, right? The pasuk is referring only to the nachala of the father, which is clear, right? The pasuk, they missed the words here, nachala of the father. That's because it's obvious. The pasuk's only really worried about the nachala of her father, right? It even says it. We're worried the nachala of your father needs to stay in its proper place. Bein b'sibara bein b'sibara bal, right? Whether it's going to go through her son, whether it's going to go through her husband, either which way we resolve that issue, because the mother's property is already considered as if it was moved to Reuven, and that's why we ignore that issue. And the father's property, which is the subject of the verse, will be resolved by her marrying someone from Reuven. And then her father, who's from Reuven, her father's property, which will go to her, will end up in Reuven. And that's how he simply answers this. But Abaye is not satisfied with this and says, I didn't read the second part of Rav Yeimar. Rav Yeimar, which is basically a review of what Abaye said, Iyamar lo amrinan shekvar husba. But if we want to go with what you said, lo husaba, that we don't view this land as if it was transferred, then you're right. There would be no way to read this pasuk. If we don't view the land of her mother as if it already moved to Reuven, then you're right. There's no way to read this pasuk. Because if the pasuk says, right, this all ensures that the land stay in its proper place, well, by marrying someone from Reuven, she is definitely moving land from Shimon to Reuven. So that would be a problem. And therefore, it can't possibly be that's the way to read it. So basically, when Abaye says, perhaps we don't say kfar husaba, he says, there's no way you can't say that, and that resolves your question, Abaye, and that's how Rav Yeimar understands it. Okay, but Abaye is adamant that there must be a way to read it otherwise. So he explains here's an explanation of Abaye's approach. He says, and this is kind of explains why he suggested that maybe we say lo husaba. And now he has to read the pasuk a little differently. Now, if you thought this was limiting, okay, talk about the shidduch crisis, right? And the trouble of people getting married and finding the right spouse. This woman who's supposed to inherit is now stuck because she has to marry someone from Reuven, right? Okay, it's not terrible. It's a big tribe, right? She'll find somebody. But according to Abaye, we say the following. She's even more limited. What do? We tell this woman, your mother's from Shimon, you're supposed to inherit from her, and your father's from Reuven, you're supposed to inherit from him. Okay, I'll tell you what. This is what you can do. You can marry someone who's exactly like you. And then, even if we don't view it that your mother's land was already past your father, well, in that same note, we won't view it yet that your land is past your husband or your son yet, because you're basically continuing exactly the way your mother was. You're doing nothing worse because you're marrying someone whose father is from Reuven, but whose mother is from Shimon, and therefore you're basically keeping it as it was. So even if you say that the mother, we don't view the land as if it already went to Reuven, but by the daughter marrying someone who's exactly the same as her, we're also not really changing it so much. It's not exactly true, because in the end, it'll go to her son, who's from Reuven, but it at least keeps it because remember, when she does it, nothing happened yet anyway. It keeps it the same as it was. It retains a sort of status quo. So according to Abaye, the way to read this pasuk, which we're going to see in a minute, doesn't really match the words in the pasuk, but the way to read the pasuk is, okay, and let's pull it up, okay, and then you'll see exactly the problem right away, which is the pasuk says, Kol bat yoreshet nachalami matop bnei Israel, which caused our whole problem from the first place. We have a daughter who's inheriting from two different tribes, Shimon and Reuven, let's say, like our example, matop bnei Israel, from the two tribes of Israel. She has to marry someone from the family of her father's tribe. Now, according to Abaye, she has to marry someone whose father is from the father's tribe, but whose mother is from her mother's tribe. That's what the Gemara is going to ask right now on Amud Bet. It should have said she has to marry someone. She has to marry someone who's from both her mother's tribe and her father's tribe. And that's not what it says in the pasuk. So how can Abaye possibly explain the pasuk in that way? To which the Gemara said, no, there's a reason why. If you had written, what would you have thought? Think about it, right? If it just said it like that, you would have said, you would have thought even the opposite, meaning she just has to find someone who's who's connected with both tribes. So theoretically, that could mean she could find someone whose father's from Shimon and mother's from Reuven. And that's why it didn't say Avi Avima, but it meant that, okay? It meant she has to find someone exactly like her that matches Avi Avima, and it just didn't mention Ima so that you wouldn't get confused and think that you could do a flip. Okay, and that's Abaye's reading, which is a very kind of strange reading, right? It's a weird reading of the pasuk. So we have two ways in this section to understand that pasuk. Either we say she's allowed to marry someone who veers from the tribe of her mother, even though she's going to inherit from her mother, as Rabbi Yeimar says, because her mother already is married to someone from a different tribe, and already her land was in line to be inherited by someone from a different tribe. So therefore, it's okay. The daughter's doing nothing wrong by ignoring the issue of her mother's property, because it's as if the damage was already done. If you say the damage was not already done, then you have to say that she actually has to marry someone exactly the same as she is. And that, again, like we said, creates a more limited situation in terms of who you're choosing to marry. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the very last section, which is very simple, which is we started our daf with these 5 psukim, and we suggested that perhaps, and that's why we needed all 5 of them, talking about the first 3, all the psukim that basically say you have to stay in your tribe because the land has to stay in its tribe, and you can't move it to another one, and you can't move it to another one, right? This repeat of psukim, redundancy. We said, right, one way to read it was to say one pasuk is referring to you can't do it because it's going to move to the son, right? And because your son will inherit you. And one pasuk was saying you can't do it because your husband's going to inherit you. But we said, but maybe that's not the case. And maybe, and even Rav Papa went with that and said, and therefore he kind of rejected Rabbi Yishmael's explanation and said you could understand them as all being referring to we're worried the land's going to go to the son. And there's one positive commandment here. This is who you should marry, and 2 negative commandments, and don't marry like that, right? Don't marry out of tribe because it's a negative transgression, and there's 2 of them. And then we can't prove that one is about moving to the husband, which means we can't get to our answer of where do we get this halacha, that a man inherits from her husband. It can't be from these psukim. So now the Gemara is just going to point out that there's Tanya b'sibata ben, v'Tanya b'sibata bal. There's 2 braitot that attribute, each one attributes a different verse, one to the son inheriting and one to the husband inheriting, which basically reinstates, right? If you had an issue with Rabbi Yishmael and you thought maybe it was 2 lavs and an asay and that you can't learn it from Yair and Pinchas, well, no, the braitot actually do read it this way, okay? And even though we suggested maybe there's a different way to read it, here we're going to see the braitot do prove that each pasuk is referring to a different scenario, and it would prove hasabat habal, okay? That is right, sibat habal, that the land could move to the husband, and proving inheritance. So we're only going to start this today, and we're going to leave open a lot of questions, but which we'll resolve tomorrow, which is why this pasuk that, and that pasuk that, and where did they get all this from, and we'll deal with that. But today we'll just get the intro. Tanya b'sibata ben, v'Tanya b'sibata bal, and we're only going to see one of the braitot today. Tanya b'sibata ben. Okay, so here's the one about the pasuk that's attributed to land going through, right? Again, the wife has to marry within her tribe so that when she inherits land and she dies, it won't go to her son. Veloti, so which pasuk is that? Veloti sov nachala lebnei Yisrael mimatel mateh. That was the first pasuk, pasuk Zayin, the first pasuk in the order, not the first one that was quoted in the Braita. The first one quoted in the Braita was the positive one. Here's the negative. Don't let nachala, right, move from tribe to tribe. B'sibata ben hakatuv medaber. So the Braita sets up, that is talking about how would it move from tribe to tribe, because it would go to her son. Ata omer, this classic midrash halacha, how do you know that that's what it's talking about? Maybe it's talking about something else. Ata omer b'sibata ben, or b'sibata bal. Maybe it's moving to the husband. Maybe it's talking about land that she'll transfer to her husband. Well, kashu omer v'lo tisov nachala mimateh lemateh acher. Well, there's a different pasuk, pasuk tet. When the ninth pasuk in that parak says, don't move nachala from tribe to tribe, to a different tribe, that one must be referring to the husband. And therefore, back to right this reasoning, so it didn't explain too much yet. All it basically explained was, because there's 2 psukim, we assume the first one was we're worried it was going to be transferred to the son. Second one, worried it's going to be transferred to the husband. So that's the first Braita, and then we're going to see the second Braita tomorrow, and then we're going to make some order out of it. Why did they go in that order and say that, and we'll deal with a whole bunch of questions they have in this Braita tomorrow. Just a sec before I summarize. Okay, so summary of the daf. We started with the 5 psukim of Rabbi Yishmael, the second way of darshaning how we know a woman inherits from her woman passes on her inheritance to her husband. The 5 psukim, what do we need all the 5 psukim for? Rav Papa's question, which was left as an open question according to the way we read the sugya. Again, some people think Abaye actually answered, but that's not the way we read the sugya. Then we have Abaye's question about the pasuk, about the matot. If she's going to inherit from 2 tribes, how does it resolve the problem to keep her within the shevet of her father when the shevet of her mother is also going to be moved to a different tribe? To which we either say it was going to be moved anyway, so it's not her fault. It already happened in the generation before her. So it's as if it was already moved, even though it didn't yet. And Abaye, who doesn't accept that, who basically says she's going to have to marry someone who's exactly identical to her, has both a father from this tribe and a mother from the other tribe. And then we went to just point out that there's 2 braitot that basically say that one pasuk is talking about the son and one pasuk is talking about the father, the husband inheriting, and thus reinstating what Rabbi Yishmael said, which is you really could prove from the psukim that, and then you wouldn't actually need all the 5. You wouldn't need the Yair and the Pinchas psukim. You would just need 2 of the psukim to prove that inheritance goes to the husband. With that, we finish for today. Reminder, like I said in the beginning of class, there won't be a live shiur on Friday. All the dapim are already up on the site. You can find them. And if you want to learn in advance, the dapim for the upcoming Chag, okay, for Thursday, Friday, and Shabbat. Wishing everyone a good day and Shishma B'Sorot Tovot.